Welcome back to False Dichotomies. I'm Cy Castells.
I'm Daria Quinn.
And today we are talking about arguably the best Kevin Smith movie ever, Dogma.
Yes. And so Kevin Smith started off his film career with a movie called Clerks. Is something of a cult hit. Honestly, one of my favorite movies.
And it's an excellent example of what I like to call the democratization of art and media, because this was during the 90s when this was not during the time when everybody had a cell phone with a camera on it, let alone a camera good enough to take decent audio and video recording. So he was working as a clerk at a convenience store at the time, and he got the cheapest equipment he could find, and he recorded a movie inside of the convenience store during off hours.
Yes.
So using what he had and what was immediately surrounding him, using his friends as actors,
yes, and
created a cult hit and launched his very long and prosperous movie career.
Yes, the Quick Stop and the video store, those are actual places in Leonardo, New Jersey.
After writing and directing a few more movies along similar lines that were mostly about people talking about their lives and their changing relationships and stuff like that, he got enough cred in Hollywood to do a big budget fantasy adventure story. And that's how we ended up with Dogma. So Dogma is like I said, a fantasy adventure story, and it takes place in a universe where the teachings of the Catholic Church are true, including the existence of angels, the narrative of Lucifer being a fallen angel, and Jesus being the Son of God. All of these little details of Catholic dogma are literally and really true in this universe. And we have a couple of fallen angels who have figured out a loophole to get back into heaven. And Bethany Sloan is contacted by Metatron, the angel who is the voice of God, played by Alan Rickman.
Yay!
To stop these two angels from re-entering heaven.
And thus negating all existence.
Well, we'll get into that, and the whole story sort of comes out in stages. Bethany doesn't find out until later that she is actually a long-distant relative of Jesus Christ. She does not find out until much later that God actually is missing. And when Metatron, the voice of God, came to charge her with this quest, he wasn't coming directly on God's orders as he originally purported. He originally led her to believe. She also meets along the way a couple of prophets who are Jay and Silent Bob, the recurring characters in the Kevin Smith cinematic universe. And she also meets a muse who teaches her that God is a woman, or at least could be thought of as one. And she meets a 13th apostle played by Chris Rock,
who was left out of the Bible because he was black.
And not only that, but teaches her that Jesus was black. Or at least he would like her to believe that. Well, there's some it doesn't quite fit into what we know of the history of racial designations in the world. The categories of black and white were not invented until much later in history. But
Jesus was pretty much agreed upon historically to be a not white dude.
Yeah. He was at very least Semitic. Yeah. And, considering the time and place that he lived in, it was a very ethnically diverse region of the world.
Right.
He could have, his ancestry could have come from Europe and or the Middle East and or Asia and or Africa. He could have been completely multiracial, as far as we know. And I don't know what, but we're getting ahead of ourselves into this. So that's the basic basic premise of the story. But one of the great things about this movie is that throughout the movie, the characters have all these profound philosophical discussions about the nature of the universe, the nature of God, the nature of morality, how to deal with suffering, what the role is of spiritual life in our everyday lives. And all of these conversations, they're not just window dressing. They're not just like an aesthetic choice that the director made. These are conversations that actually propel the plot forward, and they inspire decisions that steer the story in entirely new directions.
Oh, basically the plot of Dogma are these philosophical questions. And this movie, even in its opening disclaimer, purports to be this, silly comedy movie, sort of the fart and dick joke sort of thing. Yeah. But it's like a lowbrow comedy. It's disguised as a lowbrow comedy, but it's completely not. It's really, I kind of look at it more like a superhero movie. Certainly a comic book inspired movie, but there's no comic to speak of.
Yeah.
But it's played out in such a way that it feels like it was based off of a comic book. And in a way, I think a lot of religious mythology can be read that way. The different angels, the fall of Lucifer, and blah, blah, blah. It really just sounds like incredible mythological fiction.
And in fact, in the ending credits, there was a long list of comic book authors, writers, who were acknowledged as helping with the inspiration, including the likes of Neil Gaiman and Grant Morrison. And I recognize those as huge names in the comics.
And industry. Gaiman was obviously a huge name. Morrison was a huge name even back then. Yeah, those were definitely heavy hitters, and definitely an influence on this movie, because there are parts of Dogma that feel like they could have been written into Sandman comics.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I definitely see Sandman's influence. Although I would push back against your assertion that this is not lowbrow comedy because it has these highbrow ideas in it. Because in that same disclaimer, and also throughout the movie itself, people describe God as funny. And when Bethany asks Metatron, what is God like? He says that God is lonely but funny. Almost every single character at some point describes God as having a sense of humor. So I think that that's part of the point. That, yes, this is lowbrow comedy. There's fart jokes. There's sex jokes.
There's a shit demon.
There is Spoilers. Jokes about jerking off. And the sexuality aspect of it is also wrapped up in there, because sex is repeatedly referenced in humorous ways, but in a way that kind of reinforce that sex can also be spiritual. And we'll get into that later as well.
Okay. So where do you think we should start with this discussion?
Well, in previous episodes, I think we often started by talking about how we found out about this and how we first experienced it.
I was aware of Kevin Smith as a director because MTV had a big push for the Mallrats movie before it came out. And there was specials, and there was programming that went along the lines of hyping the Mallrats movie. And I had always intended to see Mallrats, but I never got around to it. And a couple years later, there was advertisements for a movie called Chasing Amy, which I think is another movie we should probably talk about.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. I would love to see Chasing Amy again, for knowing everything that we now know about fluid sexuality.
And so the reason I bring up Chasing Amy was I was taking a drama class in high school at the time. And we would have these drills where we would have, we would throw in like movie titles or whatever else, and people would try to like act them out, sort of a charades thing. And I put down Clerks before I had ever seen it, knowing that it was a movie.
Okay.
And I was told straight up, this is not a movie. Yes, it is. The advertisements are on television from the director of Clerks, Chasing Amy. And people looked at me like, they're on like normal TV. They're like sitcoms and MTV. Like, am I the only person that ever saw these commercials? And it was weird. But to be fair, when we did this with song titles, I gave them standing outside of a broken phone booth with change in my hand. Can't remember the name of the group. I've been downhearted, baby. I've been downhearted, baby, ever since the day you left me. It was this really long, complicated name, and they just looked at me like, the fuck is wrong with you? I want to win. About 2000-ish, a friend of mine showed me Dogma. He said, this is a movie that'll be right up your alley. And it was, obviously. From then, it was like, okay, let's go back. Clerks, loved it. Mallrats, loved it. Chasing Amy, didn't hate it, but I kind of feel like
you know stuff now that you didn't know then.
What I feel now is that Ben Affleck's character in Chasing Amy should not have been treated as the hero of the story.
Yeah, that is something that probably doesn't hold up as well after recent social changes.
But however, I feel like when in Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back, that character's probably put in its villainous place.
Yeah,
we should probably do all the Kevin Smith movies at one point.
Eventually, yeah.
But yeah, so I got into Dogma right before Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back came out. So it was like I was on board.
Dogma was, like you, the first Kevin Smith movie I saw. I was a child at the time.
I was just out of high school.
Yeah. I was in my preteens or early teens. I'm not sure exactly when. I've brought up in the past that my dad influenced a lot of my media experiences early on. And Dogma was part of that because he has a very crass sense of humor himself, and I have inherited that. And he's also, along with my mom as well, a former Catholic. Both of them were raised Catholic, and both of them, as adults, rejected Catholicism. And to give you an idea of the timing of my dad's deconversion, I guess, apparently my older brother was baptized Catholic and I was not.
And your older brother is how many years older than you?
Less than 2.
Okay, so it was relatively quick.
Yeah, well, I mean, it wasn't quick. It was slow, but that was when that part of the, transition happened.
Gotcha.
Apparently it took him a few more years to actually reject his belief in God. But yeah, that's his story, not mine, so I can't really tell it. So I was allowed to watch this, and it was one of the first adult movies that I got to watch because it's in terms of the swearing and the sexual content and the violence. It was a whole lot more adult than most of the other stuff that I had exposure to.
Right.
But because I was a precocious little child, what I liked most about it was the intense philosophical discussions and the dialogue. And so that was the part that I really remembered much more than anything else. Although when I watched it again, I realized, wow, taken all together, this movie is impeccably edited, impeccably framed. Every frame is perfectly set up. The colors, the sounds, the music, all of it are in perfect harmony.
Yeah, this is a very well, like you said, very well edited movie. Something I realized while watching the bonus disc of the deleted scenes. In that, Kevin was saying that the original cut of this movie was closer to 3 hours. And thank God that cut does not exist because of the deleted scenes I saw, maybe 2 of them would have actually done anything to move the plot. It would have done anything to serve the movie.
Yeah, I think it's like...
And then the rest of them were just like, oh, God.
I think it's like really helpful to have those deleted scenes and extra information if you are a hardcore fan who really wants to know more about this universe and more about these characters.
Yeah.
And I think we qualify for that. But ultimately, the movie stands alone without them, and it does so very, very well, in part because it is so well edited. Nothing is left out that would make the movie less confusing. Only stuff that would make it richer and more detailed.
Right.
And in ways that the average viewer isn't necessarily going to be interested in. Like, I can't remember if it was in a deleted scene or in an interview, but I remember finding out at some point that Bethany's infertility was caused by a botched abortion.
I know that was one of the deleted scenes I saw. It was Bethany counseling a young girl about her abortion, because that was... They never really went into Bethany's job in the original cut. Yeah, Bethany's job at the abortion clinic was a counselor. And she told this girl a story that Bethany was dating a man in college, and she got pregnant, and he wanted her to have the baby, but that would have meant her dropping out of college and basically screwing over her life and not having a career or whatever else. And Bethany was not ready to make that kind of sacrifice. Bethany was clearly not ready to be a mother at that point. And the dude's mom worked at a clinic. So if she went in to try and get an abortion, his mom would have found out and would have gone back to him. So she had a med student do it. A med student that then... dropped out of med school, and when school was over and she had married her school sweetheart, and they were trying to get pregnant, it wasn't happening, and she went into the doctor and she found out that she had the infection that destroyed her uterus, and thus he divorces her. And
So in the movie, all you know is that she works at an abortion clinic and she's medically infertile. And those are both like enough to get you to understand where she's at in the plot, where she is at in relationship to the Catholic Church, in relationship to God, in relationship to her body and femininity and her womanhood. But knowing all that extra information, if you really care about understanding her really well as a character, that stuff helps a lot.
Yeah.
So I watched this movie a lot as a kid, kind of almost memorized the dialogue. And then I grew up and I thought I kind of grew out of that kind of spiritual thinking. I started to take Christianity more seriously and realized that it wasn't just a joke anymore. So I was a practicing Christian for approximately 5 years of my life. Although I never quite swallowed the Christian dogma that, well, you and I both know that not all Christians are, quote, like that in terms of their political beliefs, their moral beliefs, their...
those are the ones you're going to run into.
Yeah.
Like, if you're going to... We have a mutual friend who is probably the one reason I have right now to believe that God might not be a complete asshole.
Yeah, and she's a member of the United Church of Christ, which is one of those denominations where they are radically non-judgmental, like Jesus.
So it's like if you're stumbling around the world and you run into a believer, you're probably not going to run into a member of the Universal Life and the Universal Church of Christ.
United Church.
Yeah,
UCC.
Yeah.
Just call it UCC.
You just said it, and I completely forgot what it was called.
And if you're listening, Skylark, we love you.
She probably is.
Yeah. She's also like one of the vegans that I know who will absolutely never judge you for eating meat. because that's just the kind of person she is. So I kind of like didn't watch this movie again at all for several years. And then the next time I picked it up was on January 14th of 2016, which was my birthday. And it was also the day I found out that Alan Rickman had passed.
Yeah.
And it was also 5 days after my ex-husband had left. So
this was not a good day.
It was not a good day. I also had a wicked hangover from the night before because that was when I started binge drinking on a regular. So I had this like awful day. I went out and got myself some like cake and just ate it by myself while watching Dogma because that was the first movie I thought of that had Alan Rickman in it. Mm-hmm. And I didn't even realize until like I was watching it, oh, this is also a movie about a woman who had been abandoned by her spouse. Mm. So I really fell into a much deeper empathy for Bethany during that watching. And then that kind of prepared me for this most recent watching where I was like suddenly ready to see all of the things that this movie had to offer that I had never even noticed before.
So our premise are two renegade angels who have been cast out of heaven. Now, here's how that happened. So we are in the plagues of Egypt. Mm-hmm. Okay? And Loki is the angel of death.
In this universe, he is neither a Marvel supervillain nor a Norse god. Just go with it.
Okay. Yeah, Loki is the angel of death. He is the one that rained sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah. He's the one that turned the rivers red. He was the one that took the firstborn of Egypt. Right. So he's done. He just finished killing all the firstborn of Egypt. And Bartleby is a watcher among the angels, which basically means he watches us and records our stuff.
He's a people watcher. Throughout this movie, he watches people. Yeah. You can see him doing it, and he loves it.
So Bartleby takes Loki out for a drink, and they are drinking, and in this, Bartleby has a philosophical conversation with Loki about whether or not it's ethical to kill in the name of God.
So it's like I said earlier, all of the major plot points are directed by these conversations.
Yes. Basically, Bartleby is able to convince Loki to quit his job. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, Loki is drunk as hell.
Mm-hmm. And plus, he's Loki.
Yeah. So he goes up to God, throws down his flaming sword, says I quit, and gives God the finger.
Yeah. Because that's totally a thing way back then.
So a couple things happen. Number one, God decrees that angels are no longer allowed to imbibe alcohol.
Yep.
Number two, Bartleby and Loki get kicked out of heaven and decrees that they are banished from heaven for eternity. Yes. And even when they are left in Wisconsin for the whole of human history, and when it's all over, they have to sit outside the gates.
Never mind that Wisconsin didn't exist back then.
But
but whatever.
We're going with the logic of the movie.
Yeah.
So the idea is Loki and Bartleby aren't in hell, aren't going to go to hell, even when it's all over. They're just going to be outside of everything. There's hell's going to be over here. Heaven's going to be over here, and Loki and Bartleby are going to be in the middle of the wastelands playing cards or something. Mm-hmm. And so thousands upon thousands of years pass, and Bartleby gets a letter in the mail. He gets an article of a newspaper sent to him. The Catholic Church has this thing called the planetary indulgence.
Plenary
indulgence, which is basically a get-out-of-sin-free card. So, in fact, that is one of the sticking points that created the Protestant movement.
Yep. That was that was, I think that might actually have been the main one. It's because in its original form, plenary indulgence was you could pay money to the Catholic Church to get your soul into heaven. Yeah. And that was a bad thing because it privileges the wealthy. So, however, this is an interesting subversion of that understanding of it, because it is anyone who walks through this one church's door on this one day.
Yes.
Regardless of, and yeah, if you don't live in the area, it might take some wealth to get there, but it is a whole lot more egalitarian than the original concept of plenary indulgence.
Yeah. So a church is holding its centennial celebration, and if you go under the archway and come back out, you come out with a clean soul. Now, if you have a clean soul and you die, you go to heaven. Now, Loki and Bartleby would have to cut off their wings and transubstantiate into human form in order for this to work, and therefore they won't be returning as angels, but they will get back into heaven, which sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, it does sound like a good idea. Except. Now, this story is all related to Bethany in the exposition by Metatron, who is an angel, who is the voice of God, played by Alan Rickman. And according to Metatron, and I have this quote, "Now listen closely, because this bit's very important. Existence, in all its form and splendor, functions solely on one principle. God is infallible. To prove him wrong would undo reality and everything that is. Up would become down, black would become white, existence would become nothingness." Now imagine that read out in Alan Rickman's amazing British accent.
Which, of course, gives it like 1,000 more times,
yes,
like power.
Yes. I would do it myself, except my imitation of a British accent would be worse than my American accent.
I would say, for the sake of all of us, please don't.
Absolutely not. Okay. So, and I have my own thoughts about this that I will save for later. That basically sets up Bethany to go on this quest. And how much of this movie do we want to summarize, or do we want to sort of skip around and touch on the themes without doing a blow-by-blow?
I feel like summarizing the movie would not be in our best interest.
Yeah. It's a really dense movie with a lot of action scenes. How about this? How about this? If you haven't seen it, go see it.
Then come back. To expound upon the concept of God being infallible and how that is the fabric of the universe. Okay, so there is a major difference between Catholics and Protestants. And now, of course, I'm using these terms very broad, and Protestant especially in a very broad sense. Basically, Protestant is anything that isn't Catholic. And there are hundreds of denominations of Protestant.
Yeah.
So one of the uniting factors is who can speak to God. According to the Catholics, the Pope has a direct line to God. So basically, whatever the Pope says is the word of God on earth. As Bartleby explains it to Loki, Jesus left in part on the first whoever the hell the first Pope was.
Peter.
Peter was the first Pope. Okay, so he imparted on Peter the first Pope.
He was the Rock.
Yeah.
I mean, not Dwayne Johnson, different Rock.
So he imparted on Peter and basically said, anything you hold true on earth will be held true in heaven. So basically, whatever the Pope says is the word of God on earth. Well, Protestants do not believe that there is a middleman. Protestant generally believes that God can speak directly to the individual. You can also pray directly to God. Whereas Catholics, you have to go to a priest for confession. So you can't pray to God to confess your sins directly to God. You have to go to confession. There are prayers to saints. There are prayers to the Mother Mary. There are go-betweens between you and God. Whereas the Protestant generally does not believe that. They believe that there's a direct line. So here's the crazy thing. Which is worse? A universal belief that only one guy really has a line to, and whatever this guy says goes. Or millions upon millions of yahoos all claiming to that they are speaking to and for God.
I think neither is true.
I mean, I'm not saying either is true, which is worse.
Yeah, I'm like, and yeah, that's something we'll get deeper into as this goes on as well. But like, I don't think that the idea that this is something that is a hard and fast difference between Catholicism and Protestantism, I don't think that's quite true either. I think it's a little more complicated than that.
It's definitely a lot more complicated than that. This is a very simplified
and
version.
One of the things that we learned in this is that the simpler something looks, the more deceptive it possibly is. And deception is one of the main themes in this. Yes. I think that deception and manipulation are very much core themes of this film, and that's established in some of the very opening scenes. We see, for instance, Cardinal Glick using the language of advertising to appeal to young people. Cardinal Glick, by the way, being played by
our friend
George Carlin, and absolutely the perfect person for this role. He was raised Catholic himself, so he understands. And he has also spent his entire career criticizing both organized religion and the language of marketing. Yes. So, like, Cardinal Glick is absolutely right up his alley. The Catholic Church is a whole lot less unified than you might think.
Right.
For instance, we have like the Eastern and Western traditions.
Right.
There's the Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox Church that have like arguably as legitimate a claim on the papal lineage than as the Roman Catholic Church. But there's also, like, within the Roman Catholic Church, there are, for instance, feminist movements. There is a women's priesthood movement that is alive and thriving.
Wasn't Sinead O'Connor one of those for a while?
Sinead O'Connor was an ordained Catholic priest at one point, although I haven't looked into that.
Right.
I don't think she was part of the women's Catholic priest movement necessarily.
Okay.
That, at least not the version of it that I know. But I briefly dated a guy whose mother was a Roman Catholic bishop.
Okay.
Well, and still is one. And as you can possibly guess by him being her son, this is a movement within Catholicism that not only allows women to be priests, but allows priests to marry and have children.
Right.
Which means that priests can have sex and not sex with little boys. So it's a really radical reimagining of what Catholicism can be in the modern world. And it has roots going way back into hundreds of years into the past. And also there is, and we'll get into this, a strong tradition within Catholicism of mysticism, which mysticism in a nutshell is spiritual practices and experiences that involve an individual connection with the divine. Regardless of what religion you're practicing mysticism within, most religions have some element of mysticism in them, and Catholicism is no different. And quite often, Catholic mystics are much more radically accepting of diversity, accepting of the forgiving nature of God rather than the judgmental, punishing nature of God. They tend to be much more tolerant of the divine being mysterious rather than defined by easily understood rules.
Right.
So, and that's something that I see a lot of in this movie, and I have lots of notes to that effect. There's one other thing that I really wanted to zero in on in this discussion, and that is, especially since we are trans people,
yes, how
gender is handled in this film.
Yes.
Like I said, the gender politics within Catholicism is really complicated and frustrating sometimes.
Yes.
And Bethany herself, the main character, has some gender-related problems in her personal life. one of the ideas that she encounters on her journey is the idea that God is a woman. And when she hears that, she immediately starts making the switch from using male pronouns for God to using female pronouns, which is something that we are fully used to experiencing both ourselves and in observing other people, as we observe after someone has come out as trans, the ones who actually accept that identity will sometimes take some time to figure out making the switch from one pronoun to another.
Now, there is a deleted scene where Serendipity explains to Bethany the logic of why God is a woman.
Yeah, because that's something that seems like a contradiction when she first springs up the idea, because she says in the non-deleted scene that she is not a woman because she does not have genitalia.
Right.
But then she refers to God as a woman, knowing that if genitalia are a human body thing,
right,
then why would God have genitals?
Well, the thing of why God is a her is, or at least is explained by Serendipity, is because when everything goes wrong, when you're hurt, when you're in need, who is the one person you go to? Who's the one person that can make it all better? Mom.
Oh. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense if you have a good mom.
If you have a good mom. We are to assume that God is a good mom.
Yeah. And I think that makes sense. And I think that Bethany probably did have to hear that, because we don't know about her relationship with her dad.
It's never brought up.
Yeah. And, but we do hear at least one mention of her mom. She recalls that when she was going through something, she was talking to her mom to get support. So yeah, that makes sense, given that Bethany does go turn to her mom when she needs help. And that kind of goes back to the concept of the buddy Christ a little bit, because
doesn't it just pop?
But in rebranding Jesus as the buddy Christ, Cardinal Glick says, God didn't come to Earth to give us the willies. He came to help us out.
He's a booster.
Yeah. And he takes that in a direction that's kind of crassly commercial. And
but it seems to have right idea.
Yeah, his heart's in the right place, but his brain's got to wake up.
Yeah, well, hi Serendipity, we're still quoting you.
Yeah. It's such a fucking quotable movie.
Yeah.
Oh, and also, I was thinking, I tried to find out if someone else had done the math on this, but Serendipity says that she's responsible for 19 out of the 20 most highest-grossing films of all time.
This was, of course, in 1999.
Yes,
so
which means...
that has changed.
So I tried to think, does that mean that she inspired Titanic? Because she said she'd been on Earth for almost 3 years.
So Titanic would probably not be hers.
Yeah, unless she inspired it, but wasn't around when it actually got made. And we know that James Cameron had been at least wanting to find the Titanic, if not make a movie about it, for quite some time.
Yeah.
So, maybe. But she definitely inspired Gone with the Wind.
Yes. Everything except Home Alone. Somebody had to sell their soul to the devil to get the gross up on that.
Yes. And considering the only other muse we meet in this series is Azrael, I wonder if maybe he had a hand in that.
He might have.
I could imagine it.
But I don't feel like Azrael was focused much on the job or the former job. I think that, especially as we get into his motivations, his energy is all being focused on getting himself out of the pit.
Yeah. Well, we can dig into his character later, I think. But so we have this seemingly contradictory idea of what gender is in this universe. And Bethany demonstrates that she can make the switch in her mind from thinking of God as a man to thinking of God as a woman. Despite having spent her entire life up until that point just assuming everything that she was taught by the church was either correct or, like, irrelevant.
And I think it's also important to note that when Bethany is using the proper pronouns for God in a later scene, the Metatron hears this. Mm-hmm. And almost insultingly adopts the feminine pronouns.
But only for, like, a few lines.
Yeah.
And it's like, and it almost seems like he's invalidating that idea, but...
It just seemed odd to me.
But also keeping in mind that Metatron is going through a lot.
Yes.
And he is not the best at taking care of other people emotionally.
Well, it's not his job.
It's not his job. And sometimes there's moments where he suddenly becomes a lot more tender. Mm-hmm. But, like, for the most part, he's caustic and acerbic. And that plays into what I realized about him in this most recent viewing, and that is Metatron is a recovering alcoholic.
Yes.
And as we mentioned before, until the plagues, angels would periodically drink alcohol. And apparently, despite the thousands of years since the prohibition, he has still not gotten over that, to the point where he does a thing that I have actually done during my sober period, and that is drinking liquor, like, by sips and spitting it out into another glass. It's just to feel it in your mouth, you know? And he also, like, at one point when they've reached their all is lost moment, when someone says, so what do we do now? He says, I say we should get drunk. And, like, considering that he's an angel, and by his own admission, if you reverse God's decree, you unmake the universe. Yeah. That's some really strong booze cravings he's experiencing right there.
Well, in his defense, existence seems like it's going to be unmade in about 12 hours anyway.
Yeah.
So, what the fuck, might as well. But, yes, that would be really stupid on his part.
Yeah, but that kind of, like, made me think, that means that most of the Bible, that the parts that are divinely inspired, if they are, were dictated to humanity by someone who is craving alcohol.
Inspired by someone who who is upset that the pen holders took their own interpretation of her inspiration.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the direct voice of God. So, like, you know, Moses and Abraham, you know, that this is the guy they would have been talking to. Mm-hmm. You know, so it's kind of like you have these two different people who probably helped write the Bible, and one of them is a drunk and the other one is pissed off because, God damn it, do I have to have a man write all of this shit?
She's a feminazi.
I wouldn't go far as calling her a feminazi.
Well, if you complain about the patriarchy at all, that's what you are.
Yeah, I would like to think we're a step above Rush Limbaugh.
Yeah.
We're a little too NPR for him.
What all this does, every single thing we find out about this universe serves the function of undermining authorities of all kinds, up to and including God herself. Because, like, okay, God's infallible, but, like, God did all of these things that all together create this awful situation, you know? So how infallible is God anyway?
And I believe you've probably seen either Philosophy Tube or someone similar discuss this on a much larger scale.
We call this the problem of evil.
Yes.
If God is good and perfect, then why would evil exist in the world?
And there's not a good answer to that.
No.
No matter what your answer is, it is a bad answer.
Yeah, or else if your preferred method of divine inspiration is mystical traditions, then the answer might just be incomprehensible.
Yes.
And therefore we can't explain it to ourselves or to each other. We'll just have to trust that at some point it's getting taken care of.
I, for a very long time, subscribed to the idea that, well, maybe God isn't benevolent. I don't know where I stand with that now because again, there is no good answer, and that is just as bad an answer as any. Mm-hmm. That, okay, well, then God simply isn't good, and everything we've been told about them is a lie.
Yeah.
But then again, there was a time where I would consider myself a very strict atheist. Mm-hmm. So it's like, I would talk about God as not benevolent as far as how he is portrayed in the Bible or how he is portrayed in various religions. It's like, you gotta really look at this guy that encouraged all of this manslaughter in his name and genocide in his name and, killing children and the plagues, the killing the firstborn of Egypt. Who does that? A sick sociopath. That's who does that.
Yeah. But again,
even if it was done in the name of freeing slaves.
We also know that all of these things were done in God's name, but not by God herself. For instance, we know that in this story, Loki decides to take up his old position as the purveyor of God's justice, and he does so with much zeal and enthusiasm. And
let's be honest here. The movie people probably deserved it.
Well, deserve is a weird term that
I don't know that one guy, the head guy at the table, the one whose sins we couldn't have spoken aloud, and the only clue we ever get is, "You're his father, you sick fuck." And whatever he did something horrible to this child, so horrible that it could not be spoken of. And the first place my mind goes to is some kind of sick molestation thing.
Yeah.
But even then, that's probably tame compared to what we're supposed to imagine that is.
Yeah, that's actually like a really useful dramatic tool that storytellers use, and that is when you leave something up to the imagination, it is always so much worse than if you said it out loud. Mm-hmm. Because our imaginations are worse than anything that is like made certain. But we know that like no input from God whatsoever, mm-hmm. Loki goes on this genocidal murder spree.
Yes.
Thinking all the while that he is totally justified.
And if he's not, he's going to do the planetary indulgence thing anyway. Yeah. You're going to come out with a clean soul. It's no big, no harm, no foul.
So, considering that even the angels have this potential to be severely morally misdirected, mm-hmm. and that the Bible is basically like third-hand knowledge filtered through like the minds of drug addicts and power hungry toxic males and mm-hmm. like all of these flawed individuals. Who's to say that God ever wanted the firstborn of Egypt to be killed?
Right.
What if that was just something that the humans and angels collectively assumed was necessary? Because humans just naturally assume that when there's another human in your path to what you need, that person needs to be gotten out of the way somehow.
Right.
The more I think about what do we actually know about the character of God, just in this movie, not in real life, right. Just in this movie, the more we know about God, the less we know about God.
And since we are on the topic of God as a character in this story, I noticed that Alanis Morissette plays God in this movie. Mm-hmm. And she does so, one, because she's friendly with Kevin Smith, and Kevin Smith likes to work with his friends. Mm-hmm. And the other is because of a song from Jagged Little Pill called Forgiven.
Yes.
Which goes into some detail about her complicated relationship with her faith. Mm-hmm. It's like, I sang Alleluia in the choir. I confessed my darkest deeds to an envious man. Mm. My brothers, they never went blind for what they did, but I might as well have. In the name of the Father, the skeptic, and the Son, I had one more stupid question. We all had our reasons to be there. We all had a thing or two to learn. We all need something to cling to, so we did. So to me, she seemed like the perfect candidate to be God in this movie simply because of that. But there's another piece to this puzzle. which is the song that she contributes to the movie.
Yeah, the ending credits song, which is, as far as I know, not in any of her albums.
Yes.
But it's a very good song nonetheless.
Yes, and it basically talks about, just go into it, I am the harm that you inflict. I am your brilliance and frustration. I am the nuclear bombs if they're to hit. I am your immaturity and your indignance. I am your misfits and your praises. I am your doubts and your conviction. I am your charity and your rape. I am your grasping and expectation. I see you averting your glances. I see you cheering on the war. I see you ignoring your children. And I love you still. And the rest of the song is basically contradiction upon contradiction upon contradiction. But in the end, I love you still.
Yeah.
And I feel like this is Alanis' take on the nature of God. Or at least it can be translated that way, is God is everything, both good and bad. And this, to me at least, reads more like an Eastern philosophy thing.
Yeah. I mean,
which she has some experience with as well.
I think also the Eastern and Western distinction is also a little bit of a false dichotomy. But let's talk about God being love for a moment.
Love is complicated.
Love is complicated. And the phrase God is love is repeated so much in, like, Christian faith, Christian propaganda, whatever. And I think a lot of people, like, shrug it off as, like, more advertising language like the Buddy Christ.
Right.
But remember that the Buddy Christ does have a kernel of truth in it, even if it's, like, been dressed up as this marketing campaign.
Right.
So maybe God being love is also a truth that has been repeated in too many superficial contexts to really have retained its power.
God as a marketing scheme. I grew up peripheral to the church, and in the 90s there was an upswing in contemporary Christian music that was partially started off by Amy Grant kind of accidentally getting on the pop charts, or Peter Cetera cursing us with Amy Grant on the pop charts. It kind of depends on how you put it. But anyway, she got popular, and because of her, three major groups in Christian music came up. DC Talk, Audio Adrenaline, and the Newsboys. And they all had some sort of minor mainstream success. But it also taught me something about the nature of contemporary Christian music. I would go as far as to say that it is a scam.
Yeah, I think I buy that.
Because I was in youth groups when this was happening. And Christian music was sold to us as, you don't want to listen to secular music because garbage in, garbage out, blah, blah, blah. So here, try some Christian music. And I would be introduced to, say, a band like Skillet, which I would be told is the Christian Marilyn Manson.
It's just sort of like, my ex-father-in-law was one of those born-again Christians who he used to love rock and roll, but now he only listens to Christian music. And he played some of his Christian music for me, and he was like, "Yeah, listen to this. It has a great sound, and I've never heard anything like this before." And I'm like, "Yeah, this sounds exactly like Evanescence."
And it's not even like a good copy a lot of times. Yeah. It's like, how do I put this? There was a band that I got into when I was into the Christian music. They were called Flight 180. Flight 180 was a ska band. Now, looking back, they are preteen Disney bullshit. They were a cheap imitation of actual ska bands. And that's, that was the thing, it's like, I'm listening to this soulless marketing. If I'm going to do that anyway, can I at least listen to something of quality? I would think I would be much more willing to put up with the Katy Perrys of the world than I would. And this is the funny thing is DC Talk broke up in 2001. And now Audio Adrenaline and Newsboys kind of kept on chugging along, but none of them have their original members. Audio Adrenaline is now fronted by a former member of DC Talk. The Newsboys is fronted by a former member of DC Talk.
So they just
And
sort of distributed
DC
the one band amongst the other.
DC Talk just took over contemporary Christian music, and here's what happened. Christian music right now is completely irrelevant. Whatever you think of, like, say, the Bryan Adams and Rod Stewart's, or whatever, if you think that is boring, you don't know boredom. You don't know boredom. You don't know stagnation. When Nickelback sounds like they have a soul,
okay,
that's what I'm getting at.
Right.
And that's.
I mean, I've heard that. I don't know.
And it's all about marketing.
Yeah.
Newsboys were the soundtrack to the God's Not Dead movies.
Oh my god!
And know those were marketing scams.
Oh god, yeah, you're right.
Damn you, Kevin Sorbo.
And Melissa Joan Hart. You didn't have to do this, Melissa.
I know.
You were a witch. Go back to being a witch. Okay, so speaking of love, though, I really love the opening scenes of the movie, which introduce the main characters, and set the tone, and also set the themes. So, like, in the first 18 minutes of the movie, we have this guy who we later find out is God in human form,
right,
getting attacked by kids with hockey sticks.
Sort of a callback to Clerks.
Yeah.
Because of the hockey game on the roof.
Mm-hmm. Then we have Cardinal Glick unveiling the Buddy Christ.
Marketing.
Yeah. We see Loki deconverting a nun by talking about a critical reading of a poem that was told in Through the Looking Glass as an allegory of religion that lures in, exploits, and destroys its followers. So he's deliberately using deception and misdirection to lure people away from the church while simultaneously criticizing the church for doing the same thing.
And Bartleby brings this up as well, is like, for a fact there's a God. You have been in his presence. He has spoken to you personally. And yet, I just heard you claim to be an atheist.
Yeah. So what I took away from this scene was proof of deception is not proof of falsehood.
Now, expand on this, please.
Just because someone is deceiving you doesn't mean that the thing they are ultimately trying to convey to you is false. And also, hypocrisy is not a sign of being wrong. And this is something that really frustrates the hell out of me in discourse these days. And that is, people think that the way to win an argument is to point out all the inconsistencies.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, if you point out all the inconsistencies in a person's worldview, you still haven't proven any of those things wrong.
Right.
Because any one of those things could be true. It just means that the things that contradict that part of it aren't.
Mm-hmm. Well, when it comes to modern debate,
yes.
I'm putting up the huge, gigantic, like 99,000 point air quotes debate. I don't feel like the concept of modern debate is about coming to a truth. Mm-hmm. It's about winning. Yeah.
I think that a lot of what happens in this movie is what's called dialectic.
Right.
That is, two people with contrasting beliefs talk to each other about those beliefs. In philosophy talk, we speak of those two conflicting ideas as thesis and antithesis.
Right.
And the goal of the dialectic is to merge those two viewpoints and form what's called the synthesis. And what that does not mean is the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Right.
The truth is where the truest parts of each idea are most in harmony with each other. Mm. And unfortunately, what a lot of discourse these days, it isn't thesis and antithesis coming to a synthesis. It's one idea and another idea just beat each other up until one of them is slightly less beaten up than the other.
And victory is achieved depending basically on what goals you set for yourself. Mm-hmm. If the other person decides, I don't want to fucking deal with you, block, they blocked me, I win. Mm-hmm. No, they just decided that you were no longer worth conversing with. That they've decided, I'm not going to waste my time on this anymore. Mm-hmm. We have people who have never learned to truly debate. Mm-hmm. And I think part of it is because the debate team is not a requirement in schools, and maybe it should be. Mm-hmm. But there are other reasons behind it too, and it's like part of it is a debate won't matter either way if you're not going in with good faith. And very few people these days, even the best, like you and I could go into a debate with someone, mm-hmm. and we may not necessarily even be going into it with good faith just because of the culture that's been created around the modern discourse.
I'm not going to argue in good faith with, for instance, a transphobe whose goal is to make sure that I'm not allowed to exist.
Right.
Like, that is not a situation that calls for fighting fair.
Yeah.
Like we were talking about before.
I'm not going to go into a good faith argument with a Nazi. I'm not going to go into mm-hmm. a good faith conversation with a TERF. Mm-hmm. I'm probably not going to come out of that confrontation better either way. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to have learned something. I'm not going to have accomplished something intellectually or even cathartically. I will get nothing out of this other than misery. Mm-hmm. So why should I play fair if I'm only going to end up miserable at the end anyway? And two, why should I even engage if I'm going to end up miserable anyway? But
right. Another thing that this one scene communicates is that this is a story that will be told through stories.
Right.
Loki is using a story that is within a story, within the story of this movie.
Right.
And throughout the movie, we also see other people telling stories to each other to get their points across, which is reminiscent of another person that we know of that gets talked a lot about in this movie, and that is Jesus, who made a lot of his teachings through parables.
Right.
And that is a well-honored tradition within most religious traditions, mm-hmm. is the use of stories to convey moral or ontological or cosmological or historical lessons. Mm-hmm. And then the next scene in that opening segment is a Catholic priest giving announcements in front of, and it's not a sermon, it's just the announcements.
And the clergy are your easy jokes, are your low-hanging fruit jokes about mm-hmm. what people actually do when they're sitting in church. Mm-hmm. There are people who look bored. There is a guy who has headphones
There's
on.
3 children fighting over a movie doll.
There's in one, I believe it might have been cut, but in that sequence, there's also a guy with a Hustler magazine inside his Bible.
Yes. So he's actually the 3rd Catholic clergy person that we meet in that opening sequence.
Right.
Because there's Cardinal Glick and there's the nun. Mm. And Glick is this slimy appearance obsessed marketer who's like a high-ranking member of the church. And the nun is just like really innocent and naive and easily manipulated because as soon as she hears that spiel about the walrus and the carpenter, she immediately like says, "What have I been doing with my life?" Right. And then there's this guy who's just a hometown pastor. He knows how to speak in front of a pulpit, but he's just reading announcements. It's just keeping his local parish running smoothly.
This might actually be a parallel to Clerks. He's just kind of a clerk sitting behind the counter.
Yeah.
Like, "Hi, I'm here. I'm doing a job." And I kind of feel like that's the pastor here. Or the priest.
That's a part of the service that's kind of that's something about the modern Catholic Church in a lot of ways is that it's very routine. Mm-hmm. And the more routine something is, the more potential there is to just like absent your mind from it.
Right.
And in some ways that can be an opportunity to like turn it into a meditative practice. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it just means that you're bored and your mind is elsewhere.
Right.
It's not necessarily possible to know which frame of mind a person is in when you observe them in that context.
Mm-hmm. In a way, I think that Linda I don't know how to say her name, Fiorentino, the actress that plays Bethany, is almost the perfect choice.
Yeah, she's very
understated.
Yeah, she plays bored really, really well.
Yes.
Like during this Catholic mass, the camera pans down mm-hmm. to her, and we see her we see her looking very blankly up at the pastor, and when the time comes for her to stand up and for the recession of faith, she stands up and she begins talking in this most defeated monotone ever.
And this is a monotone even for her.
Even for Catholic liturgy, this is monotonous. So it's just like she has not said a single word that isn't an automatic and routine part of the Catholic Mass, and yet we know everything we need to know about how she's experiencing her Catholicism right then.
I think God is dead was a quote that she had a conversation with a coworker at
the very next
clinic.
Scene.
And Janine Garofalo's character is basically suggesting to Bethany that she needs to get laid.
Yeah.
And
she comes so close to like non-binary representation because like Bethany doesn't want to get with a man because the average male is never a man, even for 10 minutes in his entire lifespan.
That sounds kind of militant. You think I'm for playing for the other side?
And Bethany's answer is that women are insane. Which I don't know if that might be because she works at an abortion clinic and she sees, most of the time when she sees other women, it is at a time when they are in really extreme circumstances. But yeah, I can understand her attitude, honestly.
Yeah, I think the other part of it too is especially when she, her response is women are insane. I feel like she's just, between that and her husband, she's had a lot of bad experiences in her life with people. I think this is more of she just doesn't like people.
Yeah, she's just done with it. She's done with everything.
Yeah. She
makes a very casual reference later to like casually abusing opioids. Because like she mentions like after Jay and Silent Bob like rescue her from the hockey kids, she says that she wants to go home, take some Percocets and lie down. And when I first saw this as a kid, I did not know that Percocets were an opioid. But yeah, like, and she works at an abortion clinic. She probably has like access to prescription medications. So that was when I realized, ooh, that was a little bit of a thing.
Yeah. And it also speaks to the fact that Bethany wants to be numb.
So I don't think that her thinking women are insane is sexist. But then Janine Garofalo suggests that she ask God for a third option. And I'm like, yes, non-binary.
Her and Bethany's response is, I think God is dead. Spoken like a true Catholic.
Yeah. Although I don't rule out the idea that she could end up with a non-binary person. I mean, anything could happen.
I think this is a low-key question that everybody should probably have when watching this movie. Why in the fuck are Jay and Silent Bob prophets? Did we just need comic relief? How? Why? What? Jay in particular is maybe the dumbest person in any of these movies.
Well, I mean, okay, look at the biblical prophets for a moment.
Okay, well,
there's a biblical prophet, I forgot which one, who, like, some kids were making fun of him for being bald. So he orders some bears to come out of the woods and eat them.
Oh, yeah. But, usually a prophet has, like, something intelligent to say.
Well, every single time Silent Bob speaks in a Kevin Smith movie.
Okay, so why is Jay there? Because we can't have Silent Bob without Jay?
Well,
obviously.
Jay actually does have some interesting things to say throughout the movie, though.
Okay.
But they're hidden. He speaks in a way that is crass and self-centered and takes nothing seriously. And yes, he is a very entitled male. But he says things like when Rufus reveals to Bethany that, and this is after he has said that Jesus was black, when he says that Bethany is also a distant relative of Jesus, Jay says, so does that make Bethany part black? So what he's doing there is connecting the two bits of information. And at the time, Bethany's like, I'm not having this right now. But Jay has reminded the audience, hey, race is not binary. race is not as cut and dry as you think. This woman looks white, but we have just received evidence that she has black ancestry.
That kind of, I feel like there's an icky side effect to that, which is the one drop bullshit.
Yeah.
Which is part of our sordid history as a country with race. And yes, it helps to remind us that one of the revelations in this movie is that Jesus was black, or certainly not white.
The other thing that Jay does is he sets an example of being utterly shameless in all of his many sins. He has as much casual sex as he can possibly get his paws on, which, again, isn't that much because he's kind of atrocious, but still.
Right.
He is a drug dealer. He uses drugs throughout the movie as well.
Right.
Oh, here's another thing about Jay and Silent Bob.
All right.
What are they doing in Illinois? They're from New Jersey. Why are Jay and Bob in Illinois?
16 candles.
16 candles. That some fuck named John Hughes.
And all his movies take place in Sherman, Illinois.
Shermer,
Illinois. But there is no Shermer, Illinois.
Yeah, so they are lured to Illinois with the promise of this 80s romantic comedy setting where all the boys are whiny pussies and all the girls are, well, how did he put it? Sweet,
fine,
whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. And no one is dealing. So they go expecting that this city that they saw in 80s romantic comedies is actually there and is exactly the way that it's depicted in the films. So they have made a significant life choice based on mistaking fiction for reality.
Which is something Jay would do very easily.
But it's also what, religious people do. They take the Bible and every little story in it completely literally and use that to make their life decisions. Now do you think that Jay and Bob might be prophets?
I'm willing to buy it a little more. I'm willing to buy it a little more. But since we are on the Christians taking Bible stories literally and making their life decisions on them, our theme song is called Deceive Me, which I made for my Save Yourself project. And it is about young earth creationists.
Yeah. Yeah.
In case anyone is wondering why that song made sense to me as an opening for this, it was a song that was, for me, it's a song that is critical of young earth creationists.
So, yeah, bit of False Dichotomies lore for you.
You had mentioned something about wanting to talk about some of your experiences.
Right. Yes. And for that, I need to actually go into my full spiel about Christian mysticism.
All right.
Time for Sai's Sermon of the Week. I'm getting a lot of this information from The Big Book of Christian Mysticism by Carl McColman. It's not a huge book. It's actually a medium-sized book, but he came up with the title before he was done writing it. And Carl McColman, an author about Christian mysticism and Christian theology and practice, specifically within Catholicism. And before that, he was an author about pagan religion and mysticism. And then he converted to Catholicism he didn't have this born-again moment where he was rejected his sinful past. He thought of his conversion to Catholicism as a natural result of his pagan practice. Because within paganism, especially modern paganism, practitioners are encouraged to follow whatever path their gods lead them on personally, without necessarily, and while following the path that he believed his gods had set him on, he ended up converting to Catholicism. So now he writes about Catholicism, but in a way that is very inclusive, and he's a very important figure in interfaith dialogue because of his experience. And in this book, he talks about Christian mysticism. And Specifically, I'm going to be quoting some bits from the chapter about paradoxes, which are something that it comes up in a lot of mystic traditions. And he opens with a quote from Niels Bohr, who is a pioneer in subatomic particle physics. He created the Bohr model of the atom, which has like the electrons in different shells around the nucleus. And what he said is, the opposite of a correct statement is a false statement, but the opposite of a profound truth may be another profound truth. Carl McColman writes on the topic of paradoxes as a mystical tradition. Mysticism is all about paradox. It's all about the ways in which God and faith always seem to be pulling us in two directions at once. Paradox is not always warmly received by those who want their faith to be weather-tight and easy to control. But those who regard faith as a relationship rather than a belief system, paradox is not nearly so threatening. When faith is large enough to encompass unknowing rather than mere certitude, paradox can be a source of joy and wonder rather than fear or doubt. A spiritual paradox may provide evidence that God is bigger than our limited human capacity for reason or logic. Now, with that in mind, remember what Rufus said about having an idea rather than a belief. And regarding God having a sense of humor, Carl McColman has this to say. Perhaps one way to look at all these paradoxes and all the ideas that go into explaining them is to approach them all as a form of play. We tend to take our relationship with God very seriously, which is understandable since a major theme of at least the Western religions is to order our behavior in a way that makes it pleasing to God. But if God wants us to take delight in Him, as in Psalm 37, verse 4, then perhaps a little bit of joy and even playfulness can be blended with our seriousness. So that's all still very consistent with the themes and messages we see in Dogma. And before I move on, I want to highlight two specific paradoxes that Carl McColman talks about within Catholic faith specifically and Christian faith generally. One of them is the question of God's gender, because there's three conflicting statements. God is Father, God is Mother, and God transcends gender. Again, as Serendipity said. From a mystical perspective, perhaps the best way to approach the question of God's gender is with a light touch and the humility that comes from unknowing. The tradition calls God the Father, but at least some voices also name God Mother. Yet the mystics remind us that restricting God to either gender erects an artificial fence around him and projects our human biases. Because human beings are embodied and gendered creatures, we inevitably need masculine or feminine language to try to make God somehow more approachable. By seeing him as a father figure or as a nurturing mother, we can relate to him better than we can through purely abstract language about a God who refuses to be captured by any image or category of human thought. So, there's that. And then another paradox that McColman names specifically is the supposed distinction between God being all-merciful and God being uncompromising in his justice, which is, I think, the central conflict in this movie. Because on the one hand, God is forgiving enough to let into heaven everybody who walks through this gate on this day. Or anyone, depending on your particular sect, anyone who says this particular prayer or confesses their sins or accepts Jesus into their heart or whatever. But also, God has decreed that souls must be punished for their sins. Therefore, Bartleby and Loki can't possibly be let back into heaven, or else it would unmake the world. And the way Carl McColman talks about this is, the Bible teaches that God's law is holy and just, but also that God is all-merciful. So what does it mean to say that God represents pure justice as well as pure mercy? How do these two qualities merge? In human terms, they seem to subvert one another. Justice demands that wrongs be set right, that we are all held accountable for our actions, that those who are weak and vulnerable have their day in court against those who oppress or victimize them. Meanwhile, mercy promises forgiveness for wrongdoing and leniency in punishment. I suspect that deep down inside, we all want God to be just toward all those who have wronged us or offended us. But we also want God to show mercy to us and to our friends. This is human nature. Mysticism, on the other hand, suggests turning this human impulse inside out. It enjoins you to police your own thoughts, behaviors, spending habits, and other actions with an eye to observing God's law, while trusting in God's mercy to shower forth love and forgiveness, even on those who have hurt you, or who oppose you politically, or whose moral values are at odds with your own. If Jesus could ask God to forgive those who crucified him, even though we have no reason to believe that they asked for God's forgiveness, shouldn't you ask God's forgiveness for all those whose behavior doesn't meet with your approval? And that's something that is never really directly confronted in the movie, is why is it only Bartleby and Loki's own actions that are allowing them back into heaven? How come no one else goes to bat for them?
Right.
Except, at one point, Bethany, who says, good for them, they beat the system.
Yeah.
And then, lo and behold, in the climax, God forgives them, lets them back. That's how I interpreted it anyway.
That's one way of putting it. I'm going to kind of not spoil it for everybody, but God comes through in the end and puts a definitive stamp on Loki and Bartleby. Mm-hmm. Primarily Bartleby, whose character arc is kind of interesting.
Yeah,
because we start off this movie with Bartleby being sort of a human lover in a sense.
Yeah, he definitely gets a kick out of like everything that humans do.
Yeah. He is a watcher. He enjoys watching people, and the first scene we're in an airport, and
he's literally eating popcorn while he's watching the humans. He finds it that entertaining.
Yeah. And he brings up to Loki is like there's this couple that are so relieved to see each other. They're like practically devouring each other in a kiss. And Bartleby brings up the fact while she was gone, she cheated on him twice. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't matter right now because they're just so relieved to see one another. And it was that sort of small thing that Bartleby enjoyed and reveled in. He loved seeing that in humanity.
Yeah.
And over the course of this movie, he has an epiphany, to put it mildly.
He calls it an epiphany.
Yeah. He starts to see, at least in his viewpoint, that humanity was always favored by God. And that humanity was given all of these chances. And he even sent Jesus down to die for them so their sins could be absolved and they could get into heaven. God shows infinite patience and mercy to these creatures, but he won't do the same for us.
I think I want to shed some light on Bartleby's Dark Night of the Soul at that moment. Mm-hmm. And yes, that's a reference to Christian mysticism. The Dark Night of the Soul is
is a thing.
He knows about Sodom and Gomorrah. Mm-hmm. He was there.
Yeah.
He knows about the flood. He knows about the slaughter of innocents in Egypt. Why is he right now characterizing God's treatment of humans as infinite fucking patience when he was there when literal genocide was being done in God's name? I think it's because he's just so lost in his emotions. He's forgotten about anything other than his own pain.
As has Azrael. Azrael's entire motivation is that he is willing to allow all of existence to be blinked out because he cannot handle one more second of hell.
And one thing we know about angels through the words of every single angel that is a character in this, every heavenly being that has been outside of God's presence, it is utterly painful to be outside of God's presence. But they always perceive humans as not feeling that kind of pain. And I think that's a little bit ungenerous of them.
Right.
Because I think that human beings do feel that pain. I don't think they necessarily know exactly where the pain comes from.
Right.
And human beings, like angels, will take the pain that they feel and they will allow it to manifest as anger and violence. And humans do that, and angels do it. And some of them, both humans and angels, mistake that violence and anger as coming from God.
Mm-hmm.
Like, remember, when Bartleby has his killing spree outside of the church, he's invoking God and, like, presenting his actions as coming from God, even though at this point he has entirely rejected God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Loki even characterizes this at one point as that Bartleby was sounding a lot like Lucifer. That this wasn't just about going home. You're talking about war on God. Yeah. And I've seen what happens when that happens. I don't think I want any part of this.
And that brings me to another point about Metatron.
What we got?
The recovering alcoholic who still, after thousands of years, still has cravings. Mm-hmm. Who has his own problems with some of the decisions God makes.
Right.
And he doesn't admit it in the beginning, but he doesn't know where God is.
Mm-hmm.
As far as he knows, God went to Earth and hasn't come back. Metatron has to be feeling that pain too.
Right.
He's an angel. Not only that, but he is the angel who is like God's mouthpiece. Mm-hmm. Nobody is more intimately connected with God in terms of, like, just being side by side than Metatron. Except maybe Jesus, and we don't meet him.
Right.
What must Metatron be going through? And as we know, as Bartleby explains, angels don't have free will. Metatron is incapable of not centering his entire existence on God. Mm-hmm. I want to bring back that quote. To prove God wrong would undo reality and everything that is. Up would become down, black would become white, existence would become nothingness. This is how it feels to have your entire existence centered on one being who is absent from your life.
Yeah.
And I kind of imagine, because, like, there's also direct parallels explicitly drawn between feeling God's absence and being abandoned by a spouse. Mm-hmm. Because Bartleby, when talking to Bethany about her divorce, they sort of share this experience. And when Bartleby is talking about God, Bethany's talking about her ex-husband. Mm-hmm. I have been in that spot where the person that I have centered my whole existence on is suddenly gone, and I don't know why. It made me suicidal. Mm-hmm. It made me a binge drinker. And that's what Metatron is going through. And suddenly I started to wonder, how true is it that proving God wrong would mean the end of the world? We already know that every single character in this movie is an unreliable narrator who's being in some way motivated by their pain.
Mm-hmm. Except for possibly Jay and Silent Bob.
Yeah, and
maybe that's why they're the prophets.
Maybe that's why they're the prophets. Because they don't take anything seriously. Because they don't bat an eye if their idols are like... It's like when they find out that Shermer, Illinois isn't real, they're just like... Their mind isn't blown. They're just like, movies are bullshit. Let's go back to New Jersey.
Yeah, at least they're like,
they just reject their old, like, false assumptions, and they, like, move on to the next thing, which in their case happens to be a bonkers quest to stop a couple of fallen angels from ending reality. That's what they're and when that happens, they're just like, yep, that's what we're doing right now. So yeah, what I'm getting at here is that any definitive statement about the nature of God and reality has got to be flawed on some level. Mm-hmm. We just are incapable of understanding what's really going on. And that's why I suspect that this entire plot didn't have to happen. And what Bethany learns over the course of the film is that her quest is not to find and stop Bartleby and Loki. Mm-hmm. Her quest is to find God.
Okay.
And that is literally what makes the climax resolve. Mm-hmm. She switches from focusing on fighting these two angels, which is a losing battle, and switches to, I think I know where God is. I think God is on life support in the hospital down the street. Mm-hmm. And she goes She has internalized the knowledge that she is basically God's next of kin.
Mm-hmm.
So if anyone on earth has the authority to unplug God, it's her.
Right.
So she goes and she recognizes her direct relationship with God and uses it to make a leap of faith.
Mm-hmm.
Unplug the life support, sacrifice herself, because while God is escaping from this body, her human body is destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And with that one leap of faith, the day is saved, because God is able to appear in front of the church just as Bartleby is about to enter and basically make everything right. The quest to stop Bartleby and Loki, that was a distraction.
Mm-hmm.
Everything about the story that was centered on fighting each other was a distraction. It was all about recognizing our direct familial relationship with God. And that's what mysticism is about. So you should look into mysticism. This is my proselytization.
Okay. Nice sermon there.
But I told you that this would relate to my personal experiences. Now, I was raised by skeptics.
Mm-hmm.
I am typically very skeptical of the supernatural. Despite being pretty skeptical by nature, I have had some undeniable mystical experiences. And quite often there is a reasonable explanation. Sometimes my experiences have involved drug use. Nothing hardcore, don't worry.
Yeah.
One experience was when I was 17 years old, and I was, like many 17-year-olds, very confused about myself and about the world I was living in, and I ended up inhaling some paint fumes accidentally, and then went to bed, and I had a really weird fucking dream. At the time, I was a practicing neo-pagan, and I followed the god Pan. You know, the Greek guy with the horns and hooves. Looks a little bit like the devil.
Anyway.
Or maybe the devil looks like him.
Anyway.
And we had sex. There was sex. It was fun. I liked it. And then we had a talk. And he told me that I had some ideas in my head that needed to be, kind of gotten rid of. And that this was all in part of the process to detox my body from a lot of deceptions that I had been internalizing. And long story short, I have been still interpreting that experience to this day.
Mm.
At the time, there were some things that I thought it meant, and I still believe that, but every few years I realize another thing that experience kind of led me to.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the more recent interpretations of that event was that one of the things that he was doing was implanting in me what would eventually become the knowledge that I'm trans. I'm going to try it. This is going to sound really, really wonky and really bizarre. Pan impregnated my female body with my male self.
Okay.
And that has had two effects. Number one, I could eventually transition. Number two, I could finally know the love of a mother who is not my mom, because I can become my own mother. And through becoming my own mother, I could come to know God as a mother.
Okay.
So that is one of several mystical experiences that I've had that inform my ideas about God, about myself, about the universe, about the nature of love. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, it doesn't matter to me whether this is true or not, because these stories were an essential part of my healing myself from all the trauma I've been through in my life. And I think that Dogma is one of those stories that we can use as a way to heal ourselves from all of the toxic, manipulative, and deceptive ideas that we've been exposed to throughout our lives. It's a story about the stories that we tell ourselves and each other. And it directs us toward a way of thinking about those stories in a new way that's kind of embracing the paradox. Mm-hmm. And not caring so much about getting everything right as much as being loving and compassionate toward one another.
Right. So, as I've mentioned before, I basically grew up in an evangelical circle. And when I say evangelical, I'm talking like full on speaking in tongues, falling in the spirit, all that stuff. And I experienced all of that. I spoke in tongues. I've been fallen in the spirit. I have experienced, the presence of the Holy Spirit, or so has been explained to me through a combination of Acts 2 and the churches I was a part of. Mm-hmm. So I've had these experiences. But yet, in 2005, I fell out of my faith for the last time and committed to atheism. How does someone that's gone through all of these experiences decide that God's not real? And the truth of the matter is that I don't know if the reality of God matters. Mm. Because I latched on early on to YouTube atheism.
Yeah.
Which
we all know where that headed.
And this was 2006, 2007, so...
Before Gamergate.
Yeah, before Gamergate, before Pat Condell went full-on right-wing. That was actually my introduction to YouTube atheism, was Pat Condell.
Mine was Nick Gisburn.
So,
he was an alright guy. He does poetry now.
Oh, that's good. From that, I, in my drinking phase, encountered a member of the Church of the Subgenius.
Ah, yes.
And he began to tell me about this thing. First thing he told me is, this is all bullshit. Okay. He goes on to proceed to tell me the most nonsensical, insane, fucking crazy-ass bullshit that one could possibly believe in, and says that people actually have a religion based on this. And I'm like, I must be a part of it.
Is this the same group that gives out cards that like authorize the bearer of the card as a pope?
Yes. Yes. You send your $35 to Bob, and you are issued a card that says that you are a practicing minister of the Church of the Subgenius. You get a packet in a black folder, and you get a bunch of church documents and whatnot, and you get an application to become a legally ordained minister through the Universal Life Church.
Cool.
So I am a legally ordained minister, and I became a legally ordained minister, one, because it was a joke, and I was like, yes, I can totally exploit the system in a very Dogma-inspired sort of thing, where it's like, shit, I want to be a minister.
I mean, if Jay can be a prophet...
And the other thing was, well, if I'm a legally ordained minister, I can legally perform marriages. And God knows whenever they decide whether or not gay marriage is going to be legal in the state of Ohio. Remember, this is 2008.
Yeah.
God knows when that's going to happen.
Ohio was one of the first states to, like, outright, explicitly ban gay marriages. Not in just in law, in our state constitution.
Yeah. So
that's how dumb Ohio is.
The Alabama of the North. So the other reason was, okay, I could be a legally ordained minister. I can marry gay people. Mm-hmm. If they ever decide that gay marriage is legal, I can perform those ceremonies, because God knows the church won't. And,
well, not all the churches.
Well,
see the UCC.
Right. So I get involved in this, and basically the religion is based on the idea that a salesman known as J.R. Bob Dobbs has made a deal with aliens to basically sell us into alien heaven or something, and that he is doing so to save the Subgenius from hell on earth and the conspiracy and the Pink Boys. Subgenius are descendants of Yeti that once lived on the lost continent of Atlantis before it sunk.
Did they get really hot there? Because, like, Yeti are pretty furry, and Atlantis isn't that kind of a...
Remember, this is all bullshit.
Maybe they had air conditioning.
Basically, everything I'm telling you is contradicted by something else in their literature. None of it makes sense. It actively encourages you to blaspheme J.R. Bob Dobbs. They'll at the devivals, they call their religion, I guess you could call them a religious ceremony, they call them devivals. And there's supposed to be one guy that is like, praise Bob, go Bob, all that. And then there's supposed to be someone on the side like, fuck Bob.
So This is a religion that really embraces paradox as a religious practice.
Yes. And it's also an industrialized church. Mm-hmm. You are saved by sending currently $35 to the Subgenius Foundation. So I believe that is based in Texas now. It used to be based in Cleveland Heights. Yeah, it was local for a while. Yeah. So, and you are given a kit and whatever, and you are quote unquote saved when July 5th, 1998 comes and the Exists, the aliens in question, come to rescue us from this pathetic planet.
And that didn't happen.
Wait a minute.
Okay.
The conspiracy, which is basically the devil, it plays the role of the devil. It's not like it's the big bad. It's the big bad. So the conspiracy has so dicked with time and space and calendars that we have absolutely no idea what year it is.
All right.
Or even what day it is. July 5th, 1998 hasn't happened yet. Or maybe it has. Maybe we are in the post-subgenius world. Who knows? Who cares? It's not that important. It's all bullshit anyway.
Okay.
And so this complete contradiction of organized religion allowed me to be able to laugh at God.
And I think that's exactly what God would have wanted.
And in this, I come across a very important part of what is my current philosophy. It is a tenet of the subgenius known as the short duration personal savior. The subgenius knows, boldadastically, is nonsense word, don't worry about that each human should do Jehovah's work exactly as he reveals it to them, and that he has wildly varying messages for different people in different situations. By the same token, it is madness to accept any one personal savior, even J.R. Bob Dobbs, as a permanent guide. The greatest of the inventions of the subgenius is the short-duration personal savior, or shorter per save for short. The true subgenius accepts into his heart, as his own personal savior, anyone and anything with which he happens to be impressed with at the moment. Shorter per saves change from hour to hour, whim to whim. It could be a hero of a show you just saw, the author of a filthy book, a bottle of Thunderbird, a good pal, a car, a dog, a sex object, a friendly croaker who scripts for you. Not professional gurus you are locked into believing, but temporary ones according to the needs of the now. They change so fast that it never gets embarrassing. You aren't inclined to proselytize them off to disinterested others who will laugh at you later. You know their effects will wear off in minutes, even though the very idea is unthinkable while you're under the influence. One needs not mention them at all, a superb tenet, since one is sometimes deeply ashamed of oneself for having a particularly unsavory short-term save. Some few can be personal saviors and false prophets at the same time. To oversimplify this in my own words, the concept of the short-duration personal savior is believe in whatever the hell works for you for as long as you find it useful. You are beholden to nothing. This is the nature of what I call spiritual free agency, which is what I can certainly consider myself, a spiritual free agent.
Wow. I totally buy that. That is like totally in harmony with everything I believe about religion as well.
The thing is that I am not what you would call a practicing subgenius now.
Well, you have the certificate.
I have the certificates. I'm still a legally ordained minister, but again, that was a joke. It is an exploitation of the system.
But the Church of the Subgenius would absolutely include that as like a legitimate way of doing it. But that's the thing
is, it doesn't matter what I do, because no matter what I do, I am both a practicing and a non-practicing member.
Lovely. I love it.
It doesn't matter. None of it matters, because none of it's real. And even if it were real, who cares? Who are you hurting?
That is exactly the same attitude that I take toward every religion that I practice. And yes, I practice multiple religions. I told you that I was practicing Christianity for 5 years. That was the time period when I was attempting to exclusively practice Christianity. But I still practice some parts of Christianity. I still carry a statue of St. John the Baptist when I feel the need to have him with me. He is, by the way, the patron saint of my family, according to my abuelita. And yeah, she may or may not be correct in that, but like her words were, she prayed to St. John the Baptist because she was pretty sure that St. John the Baptist doesn't have anything else to do, because no one prays to St. John the Baptist. And she found out that whenever she prayed to St. John the Baptist, all of her prayers came true. So she decided to ask St. John the Baptist to be the patron saint of our family.
Okay.
And sent us all statues of St. John the Baptist.
Oh, that's
And, like, I love St. John the Baptist. He first of all, he's older than Jesus. So, like,
Yeah.
he's Jesus' older cousin. He wandered around in the wilderness wearing a hair shirt and eating locusts. He was the one who was the origin of baptizing people to wash away their sins, which is like an early concept of like the radical mercy and forgiveness that categorizes the I think the most accurate versions of Christianity today. So and there's evidence that Jesus might have thought that John the Baptist was the Messiah, not himself. So there's that. But I also practice elements of paganism. I still worship Pan. There's elements of Buddhism that I follow, and I kind of want to touch on a little bit on the 2020 election, because there is a candidate who is a wonky spiritualist named Marianne Williamson.
Okay.
And she's turning into a meme because she came in out of nowhere and was on the same debate stage as Bernie Sanders on the second day of the first Democratic debate. And she's a New Age author who used to own a cafe/metaphysical bookstore. She talks about like miracles and love and spiritual healing, and the reactions of the people who have reacted to her so far are, "This is bullshit," or "Wow, this is amazing." And I am definitely in the "this is amazing" camp.
Right.
Because I know that human beings have a very strong tendency to want and crave spiritual experience. And Marianne knows this. And she also knows that if she clings on to like established religious traditions like Christianity, then she will be alienating a significant portion of the American public and the world. So she has this sort of diaphanous, like non-denominational spiritual energy. And I think it might be like, I don't know whether she's actually gonna be the nominee. I at this point, anything could happen. If we can elect Trump, we can elect anybody. So I'm not going to say she won't win. But even if she doesn't, just her being part of this race just strikes me as wholly appropriate and necessary.
Right.
Because we need more people who like acknowledge that the world is way more complicated than any of our pitiful human brains can comprehend. And we need a president who acknowledges that he doesn't know everything.
Not only does he not acknowledge that he doesn't know everything, when he's caught on it, he's still proud of it. He's still proud of not knowing a goddamn thing.
I thought it was a good movie.
Yeah, I thought so too. And it seems to be the movie in the Kevin Smith catalog that either gets overlooked or quietly erased. And it has a lot to do with the fact that it is so heavily Catholic-centric and that it upset many conservative Catholics.
Yeah. But as far as I am concerned, it's the best Kevin Smith movie. It is. And yeah, he's made a lot of really good stuff in addition to that. He's made some shitty stuff in addition to that.
Unfortunately.
Tusk.
Yeah.
Clerks 2.
I don't know. I didn't hate Clerks 2.
I did.
Okay.
But maybe we can talk about that later when we talk about Clerks 2, as I'm sure we will eventually.
I don't know. I may be giving it way too much credit because of how Randall explains the Star Wars versus Lord of the Rings fandom rivalry. I do enjoy that.
As far as I'm concerned, Kevin Smith was put on this earth to make Dogma.
Yeah.
Well, so this has been False Dichotomies. I'm Cy Castells.
I'm Daria Quinn, and thank you for spending your time with us.